Welcome friends everywhere to this special symposium which celebrates the contribution of those who have been forced to leave their country and the contribution they've made in their new lands of settlement. Before we go any further, I need to let everybody know that this symposium is being recorded, so if you have a need for anonymity, please turn off your camera and remove any identifying pieces. My name's Alan Clayton and I'm the President of World Beyond War Australia, which is the Australian chapter of the international World Beyond War movement, a movement that was formed in 2014 by the late Quaker activist David Hartsoe and the still very much alive and lively David Swanson. In putting on this seminar, I must acknowledge the contribution and support that's been given by the Nancy Shelley Bequest and the Australia Yearly Meeting of Quakers Peace Fund. The participation in this symposium has lots of moving parts. It goes to at least 4 continents and multiple time zones. The melancholy fact that unites us is that almost everybody on this call is living on the stolen lands of First Nations people. In this studio, I'm on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Woiwurrung language group of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and I extend those respects to anyone of First Nations background who is with us on this call. These were lands of teaching and knowledge sharing, and in this tradition we will conduct our work here today on their lands. This symposium is a contribution to Refugee Week in Australia. The notion of kindness and support of the stranger in need is age-long, but in terms of it being a global and institutionalised notion, this extends only to recent times and perhaps to the dislocation that followed the First World War, when the then League of Nations established travel documents known as the Nansen passports to people like Armenians fleeing the Armenian genocide. Following the Second World War, the General Assembly of the United Nations in 1947 set up the steps which led to the 1951 Refugee Convention, which was strengthened with the 1967 Protocol. These legal instruments are sometimes referred to as being part of a rules-based order. A rules-based order is something that has always been as much honoured in the breach than in its observance, and people recall the 2026 Davos presentation by the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, where he spoke of the rupture. Well, this rupture, in fact, in terms of refugee and asylum seekers, has been long established, and unfortunately Australia has been at the forefront of the sledgehammer breaking this established order in adherence to the UN Convention. People may recall the 2001 election, in the course of which a Norwegian freighter, the MV Tampa, sailed in, and in accordance with the long-established laws, practices and laws of maritime convention, took on board 430 people from a sinking Indonesian ship, mainly Afghan. And when they were brought on shore, they were not accorded the processes under the convention, but were subject to detention And what followed was the shameful Pacific solution of the Howard government, which instituted a barbarous system of offshore detention. So during Refugee Week and beyond, we have a duty to unite and reunite with bodies like the Refugee Council of Australia, with the Asylum Seekers Resource Centre, with the Australian Churches Refugee Task Force, to bring and re-establish a proper, fair and equitable system for dealing with asylum seekers and refugees, strictly adhering to the provisions of the 1951 Convention and the 67 Protocol, and to work professionally with the United Nations Commissioner for Refugees. And we have a prevailing narrative which at its most charitable is that taking in of refugees is a burden, a charitable burden for the receiving country. What this ignores that refugees bring enormous gifts and leavening influences to our culture, our literature, and if we see yesterday, the first goal scored for the Socceroos was by a refugee. And in this symposium today, we are celebrating the gifts of a particular cohort of refugees, people who had to flee. Because between the two periods of Taliban rule, Afghanistan saw a dense network of civil society groups who were bringing initiatives around peacebuilding, women's rights, gender equality, and at a national level, there was the courageous work by Sima Samar, including the establishment of an Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Tribunal Commission. There was also a remarkable group of young people, the Afghan Peacebuilders, who for 6 years up until 2021 maintained cooperative projects, helped to educate street kids, provided assistance to single mothers who were struggling to feed their children, and to work with impoverished communities. The work of this extraordinary community is commemorated in Mark Isaac's book, The Kabul Peace House, and I'm not going to say anything much more about this because our introductory speaker, Kathy Kelly, will do so, and we have the living presence of a number of Afghan peacebuilders who will be speaking here today. So when the Taliban regained power in August 2021, these idealistic young Afghans, their lives were in danger and they fled to other countries. What is remarkable is that these young people be key actors in keeping Afghan peace, social justice, gender equality struggles alive, combining direct support to people inside Afghanistan with advocacy, movement building and institutional building from abroad. Some have actually managed to write about their experiences, and I hope that many more will do this in the future. Now, we have on this call a remarkable Dominican sister, Sister Jean Clark, who had been a powerful witness for peace and social justice, including in difficult and dangerous situations in Latin America. And Sister Jean, at the age of 85, wrote her memoir. She called it All the Way In. And the title is in part a riff on a line in a Bob Dylan song. But the gist of it is that when there is a need for resistance, whether it be the invasion of Minneapolis by ICE agents, whether it be the actions of Australian state governments to criminalise protest, the authentic response is not to be dabbling around the edges, but to be all the way in. Our introductory speaker today, Cathy Kelly, has been all the way in for more than half a century. It's actually impossible to try and summarise Cathy's achievements. I'd be taking up at least half of her allocated time. I just suggest you have a look at the entry on Cathy Kelly in Wikipedia, which will just give you a brief summary. Cathy has been a founder and leading force in many peace organisations, including Voices in the Wilderness and Voices for Creative Nonviolence, which with Voices in the Wilderness, she travelled 27 times to Iraq, breaking the sanctions there to bring medical supplies and other support for Iraqis. She travelled on foot and was one of the first people to see the destruction wrought by the IDF on the Jenin concentration camp. In March 2023, Cathy was in Baghdad shortly before the start of the Iraq War, witnessing the shock and awe aerial bombardment, and remained there for 2 months. When the aerial war gave way to a ground invasion, she and other activists were there to present and greet US soldiers with dates and waters with their protest slogans in the background. Cathy has spent time in almost every significant war zone around the globe, including Lebanon in 2006, in Palestine and Yemen and elsewhere. She's been arrested over 60 times, spent almost a year in jail for the heinous crime of planting corn on a missile site in Missouri. She's been nominated for the Nobel Prize numerous times. She's the current president of World Beyond War and has been since 2022, and was a coordinator of the Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal, a citizens' tribunal that put a number of American arms manufacturers on trial. For the purposes of this symposium, she's probably one of only 2 people on the planet who can provide a comprehensive introduction to the life and work of our Afghan peacebuilders. Between 2010 and 2019, Cathy made over 24 trips to Afghanistan, living and working with our young Afghan peacebuilders in a working class suburb of Kabul. On a personal note, Cathy is a daily source of inspiration to me and hundreds, if not thousands of others. And I use the words hundreds and thousands without any sense of hyperbole, because given Cathy's, the depth, the breadth, the intensity of her involvement in the peace and social justice network, she has touched so many people. I know of nobody, or few people, who's combined the steely courage, the grit and determination of the frontline activist with total humility and a sweet equanimity. Cathy always gives credit to others, takes little for herself. It is my enormous privilege and pleasure to introduce Cathy Kelly.
Well, thank you, Alan. And I'm surely very, very grateful to Alan and everybody who has pulled together this opportunity for us to join with people all around the world to hold the Afghan peace builders in high regard and celebrate them. And I want never to forget that the idealism that was forged by the Afghan peace builders happened during a time when my country was waging war against Afghanistan, a war with immense consequences. So thank you, Alan, for that introduction of me. I want to say that my first encounter with the Afghan peace builders was actually in 2009, and it had to do with a phone call. I was part of a group in Washington, D.C., which we called ourselves Witness Against Torture. We wanted to see an end to Guantanamo. We wanted to expose the terrible realities of torture. And a friend in Washington, D.C. called us and said, "Are you aware that there are some young Afghans fasting with you?" And we said, "How did you know that?" And my friend said, "Well, if you'd read your emails." And then I realized, oh my gosh, I had been neglecting even to open emails from an Afghan youth group because it reminded me of an Iraqi youth group that was pure propaganda controlled by the Iraqi dictatorship under Saddam Hussein. And I thought, oh, I bet this is a governmental group. I'm not going to touch it. Well, I couldn't have been more wrong. And so we did have a phone call with the group of young Afghans. Now, we were in Washington, D.C. in January, and it's pretty cold then. But this group was we were in a heated church overnight. This group was in a pup tent on a mountainside in the rural province of Bamyan, huddled under blankets, shivering, and accompanying us on this fast. Well, it happened to be January 15th, which is the birth date of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. So one of my fellow fasters, we were in a circle, talking to a phone mounted on a microphone. And he said, "Can I tell them about Dr. King?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, go right ahead." And as soon as my friend Carmen mentioned the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, there was a commotion at the other end. And our young Afghan friends were trying to decide which one of them would deliver a memorized quote from a speech by Dr. King. And that's the way they were when they were very young teens. Bamyan is a place of ethereal beauty. I have a picture on the screen of a place called Bandi Amir, and it's so gorgeous you almost can't believe you're still on Earth. But Bamyan was also a place of intense impoverishment. And I grew very close to a family whose father had been killed by the Taliban. And this left his widow to raise 6 small children. And the family lacked the resources to purchase wood for fuel, for instance. They were almost always cold during the winter and often hungry. But at night especially, it could get so cold, and so they relied on heavy blankets to try and protect themselves from the harsh winter weather. But one night, one of the brothers woke up shivering in the cold, and his younger brother was sound asleep. And he thought, if I could just take his blanket long enough to warm myself up. And he kind of tried to snatch the blanket while the younger brother awakened and wanted his blanket back. The 2 brothers got into a fight over that one blanket, and the fight escalated quickly until it became so ferocious that as the other family members woke up, they realized with horror that one of the brothers had started to try and suffocate the other brother with the blanket. And so they pulled the 2 brothers apart, got everybody settled down, and they survived that night. But such a memory would always be with them. So I feel so pleased to be able to tell you that 3 members of that family were among the group that, when they went to Kabul, had very genuine empathy for families in Kabul that were finding it a struggle to survive the cold winters. And one year, there were 28 children who died of hypothermia in the refugee camps in Kabul. So the young Afghan peace volunteers devised an ingenious project. They managed to, with help from Westerners, purchase bales and bales and bales of synthetic wool, and then the kind of coverlets that every Afghan woman, it seems, knows how to turn into a big, heavy, life-saving blanket. We called them duvets. And they would sew up three ends of the coverlet, shove the synthetic wool inside of it, sew up that last line, and then batten it down with really heavy bats. And this would create duvets, which they had manufactured. And then the Afghan peace volunteers collected those manufactured duvets and distributed them free of charge in the refugee camps. It was really a very brilliant project, and many women and children were involved in being able to deliver these life-saving blankets to other people. I want to say something further about the refugee camps, because when people in these refugee camps experienced the harsh winters, they often, if they didn't have money for any kind of fuel, would start to burn tires and boots and old clothing and plastic bottles, anything they could get. And one of the refugee camps that I had visited several times, called Chari Khambar, was right across the street from a sprawling United States military base. And every day, trucks would enter the military base filled with fuel and food and water and supplies. Well, as I say, right across the street on the other side of the road, people who'd been forcibly displaced by the US war were struggling to survive. So I want to say more about how that duvet project was organized. And so let me first just mention that in Kabul, and Rosemary Morrow could verify this for me, there were always 4 huge blimps overhead spying on the people below. And much more worrisome, there were many drones, unarmed aerial vehicles and armed aerial vehicles that were able to target and track people and engage in constant surveillance. And it's the kind of surveillance we ought to be very worried about today as big conglomerates form more and more AI tech-related algorithms to identify people who might then go on lists, as has happened in Gaza, and be targeted for assassination. Well, how did our young friends determine what women would be eligible, more or less, to participate in this duvet project and earn at least a living wage while they were manufacturing the blankets? They were using surveillance. But for their surveillance, they weren't at all predatory. They weren't spying on people. Their surveys were accomplished through a notebook and a pen. And the grit and determination to go up these unpaved areas along mountainsides that were icy and a little precarious, really, until they would reach the homes of the widows and the single mothers who had been pushed up the mountainside, because the further they were from a source of water, the less expensive it would be to rent a hovel. And they would sit down and, oh so gently, ask questions of the women they interviewed. How many times a week do you and your family eat beans? Of course, nobody had meat. And what's your source of water? And how long does it take you to get to that water? And what is your rent expense? Who brings money into your family? And if that last question about a wage earner was answered by saying that it was a child under 12 years of age who earned an income. Then when our friends came down the mountainside and compared their notes, those surveys went to the top of the pile. They also had another guideline, and that was that because they wanted to form links between the Tajiks and the Pashto and the Hazara ethnic groupings, they disciplined themselves to say, okay, we're going to aim for 30 Tajik women, 30 Hazara women, 30 Pashto women. Now, that capacity to make surveys and get to know people certainly was in stark contrast to how poorly the United States military and many of the NGOs understood Afghan culture or their language or their needs. At the height of the surge, the United States military surge under the Obama administration, the statistics showed that the United States was spending in total per year about $30 billion on its war. And broken down, that would come to $2 million per soldier per year. I knew an Italian who would welcome us to come, the Afghan peacebuilders and me, to the Italian Surgical Center for Victims of War to donate blood. And I had O negative blood, so they were always glad to see me. And this Italian nurse, Emanuele, knew this statistic. And he said, almost impishly, allora, suppose, just imagine, you say bye-bye to 6 of your soldiers. You send them home early. You give me $12 million. What'd I do with it? He said, it's easy. He would build a new hospital. But the United States continued to make the choice to pour their resources into year after year after year of war. They could have recognized that as the war continued, the Taliban were taking more and more Afghan land that could have been farmland, that could have grown crops or continued the orchards. They could have said, we're going to sustain the replenishing of the herds of the flocks. We're going to reseed the orchards. We're going to make it possible for Afghan young men to earn a living cultivating the land rather than finding that their only way to earn a living was to join the Taliban or the U.S. forces. Because the more that the Taliban wanted to fund their war, the more they turned the Afghan land over to opium production. And the United States could have asked Rosemary Morrow, and she would have been able to advise what would have been a far more sensible, humane way to go forward. But instead, the United States chose war year after year after year. So the more and more people became impoverished and were forced off their land. And I want to say something about one oasis from all of that war making, and that was a place that one of our speakers on this call had developed. It was a classroom in one of the refugee camps. Nemat had met with young women who were particularly at risk, really, in these camps because, the camps were often sort of run by gangster groups, and women could be trafficked as they grew older. But in Nematula's classroom, we saw young women who were bright-eyed and gleaming. They were so happy just to be in the same room with him. And he taught them basic courses in language, and he also arranged peace circles wherein they'd each get a chance to speak in response to a prompt about what their greatest concerns were or what their greatest ideals were. And so those classes were of particular importance to young girls and their mothers. And I draw attention here to Shukriya, who wept because she had no shampoo and her hair was falling out in massive amounts, she said, because she could only wash her hair with detergent, and that not very often. And she kind of jokingly said to me, we hear so much American money comes to Afghanistan. We never saw an American bill. What does it look like? Is it black? Is it white? Is it And so the people who were most in need were often the most overlooked, but not so by the Afghan peace volunteers. And so I want to tell you a story that, again, comes from that family that I knew quite well. And when he was a young teenager, one of the sons, Abulfazil, liked to go out jogging in Kabul. And I felt great disapproval of this. Kabul's air was so smoggy and filled with contaminants, and there he'd be, exercising, but breathing in air that he shouldn't breathe in. And I was afraid he'd get hit by a car, perhaps. And so he knew I wasn't very keen on these jogging runs, but I think maybe to placate me. One morning, he said, Kathy, when I was coming back, I heard a voice begging. A woman was under the burqa, but I knew it was the grandmother of Habibullah. And Habibullah was one of the children at a street kids school that the Afghan peace volunteers ran. And he and his grandmother and his mother and his brother lived under a tarp and a very primitive wooden structure. They were desperately poor. And Abdulhai could have run right past them, but he didn't. He stopped, he listened for the grandmother's voice, and then he addressed her. He addressed her by name, respectfully, and he told her how much the Afghan peacebuilders valued her grandson, and he wished her well and kept going. He saw the person underneath the burqa. In another context, at a meeting between Afghan mothers and Masoma, who was at the time coordinating the Afghan peacebuilders street kids school, I saw that somehow, even though every cross-legged mother was covered with the burqa, Masoma had grown to know their voices, and she called each one by name. And that kind of respect for human dignity, seeing the person underneath the burqa, is so important. Well, at one point, as the Afghan peacebuilders, men and women, young men and young women, got to know each other's concerns better and better, they decided that they should try to better understand the dilemmas that each gender faced. And so the young men decided that they would don the confining and somewhat humiliating burqa with its net in front of their faces, and they would go outside wearing the burqa and walk around. Well, I thought they were going to walk around the backyard. I thought, that's a good idea. They chose to process publicly down streets in Kabul with cameras documenting it. And, well, it was a very brave thing to do. A religious leader issued a fatwa against them. One of the young men was beaten by his own family. Another was disowned by his family. But that was the kind of thing the Afghan peace volunteers did as they learned to push the envelope and as we learned to admire them increasingly. I want to tell you about another Afghan friend. His name is Zakrullah. And when he was a young boy in Bamyan, he kind of lived a double life. At night, he would go out with a construction crew. And, he was quite young, but he'd work hard. And sometimes he'd also have to go on a 6-hour trek up a mountainside with a donkey carrying big sort of saddlebags. And he'd have to try and pull tumbleweed and twigs out of the mountainside. It was rough work, and shove those into the saddlebags and then bring this back to his family, which was desperate for fuel. So often he didn't have time to do his homework. And when he went to school, repeatedly, his teacher would beat him because he hadn't done his homework. And she threatened him and said, every time you don't have your homework, I will increase the numbers of times that I lash your hand by 10. Well, he was up to having been hit 60 times with this cane, and it was just too much for him. He ran away from school and never went back because he didn't want to face 70 such beatings. Well, when he was 18 years old and in Kabul, he needed to become better educated. And so he went back to school and he sat with youngsters who were 4 and 6 years younger than him and began to learn. But by then, he had learned many things, and he actually, I think, was better educated than some of his teachers. And one of his passions, fed really by Rowe and others in permaculture, was to really understand the environment and climate change and environmental injustices. And he watched every segment of the BBC Blue Planet series. So when he was in his environmental studies class at school, knew quite a lot and always had his homework done and in on time. But his teacher had singled out 7 students to be beaten with the cane, because this was a practice in Kabul as well. And so, much to the surprise of the teacher, Zekrullah stepped forward in the line of students singled out to be beaten. And she said, "Well, you did your homework." And he said, "Yes, but there's something I understand. I know what it's like to be beaten, and I lost 4 years of my education because of that." So he asked the teacher to administer the punishment to him instead of the next 7 students in the row. Well, she obliged, and she administered blows to Zekrullah while the other students were sort of, slack-jawed. And for the next several weeks, she was confronted, this teacher, with Zekrullah's quiet insistence, because he'd studied Gandhi and King, that he take the blows rather than the other young students. Well, finally, the teacher was so furious with him, she got an even stronger rattan cane, inflicted the punishment, and then, when it came time to take the final exam, she flunked him, even though he had answered every question and had no trouble finishing the exam. So I think about Zekrullah's experience and what he was bringing when he went to another land. And I'd like to think together with all of you about that school for street kids, which Zekrullah and others organized so that every one of the young ones who came to the school received from a food bank that they'd organized a big sack of flour and a jug of cooking oil. Extremely valuable to those families. And then they encouraged their children to come to the school. And here is Nasser Lassani speaking with a young woman named Nargis. The other thing that they did with that school was teach nonviolence classes every week. There's Ali on the left-hand side would have a lecture, more or less, to present to the young students, and then they would do role plays and play games. But they also, at one point, organized those young children to collect as many toy guns as they could. And the toy guns were then pounded to smithereens. There's little Sakina with her yellow-handled hammer pounding on a plastic gun. And then the plastic shards of the guns were buried underneath the ground, and they planted trees on top of the gun graveyards. And I think that symbol shows us young people who understood what the United Nations has called for in the sign etched across the street from the United Nations: beat your swords into plowshares, your spears into pruning hooks. But what's actually scattered all across Afghanistan is still the unexploded ordnance, tremendous contaminants, and the harsh memories of war that interfered with so many people's dreams. And I want to show this photo of artists in resistance to war. So many people had to flee Afghanistan, and they went over borders to Pakistan, and that's still happening today as Afghans try to see, can we get somewhere else, even though most of the world is shuttered up and refusing people. But this was an Afghan family in the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province of Pakistan, living in a remote area, and for some reason the United States in 2010 targeted that compound with a drone-fired missile and killed the parents of this little girl. So artists in 2014 had cropped her face from a picture that showed her and her siblings carrying shrapnel from the bomb that killed their parents. And they enlarged that little girl's face, made it so huge that when they installed the enlarged photo of her face, it could be seen from aerial distances by any drone operator or anybody flying any kind of military aerial vehicle. Well, in military parlance, somebody who was killed when a drone-fired missile hit them was called bug splat because the blood that was coming forth from the person's body had a kind of heat radiation that looked like an amoeba of sorts. And so these artists entitled this installation, Not a Bug Splat. And so that dignity of human life that Afghans have learned to prize, that has often been undermined over and over again by the war makers, is something that our young friends have brought to other lands. This is a photo of Norina, one of the first cohort that went to Martela in Portugal. And Norina was somebody who had been part of training in permaculture, but when she got to Portugal, they had a very intensive 1 year training, if you will. At 5 o'clock in the morning, these young Afghans would rise, they'd go up a hillside, and under the guidance of our friend Eunice and Antonio and Terra Syntropica, they learned to cultivate plants in a greenhouse, which would then be transferred. And they also learned the culture in Mertila and disclosed a lot about their own culture. Part of that group included an infant child, Arsalan, who stole the hearts of everybody all around this small town of Mertila. And here we have Alina out in the fields that they so proudly and assiduously had helped turn from arid, desertified land into thriving cropland. Well, it's a good symbol for what our friends have done in so many parts of the world. Here are people in the city of Leiria, a kind of successor project to that Mertila project, holding up crane birds, obviously full of joy. And if you were to be with any of our young Afghan friends when they would get together for a reunion, you'd better be ready for dancing and singing and vigorous dancing. Our Afghan friends have also, many of them, learned to dance the national dance of the Pashtos, the Itan. And this is something that, in a graceful and a resilient way, they bring to other cultures. So I want to go back to that theme of war and close out by taking a look at this cartoon. This was created in 1953 in the Soviet Union for a magazine, in which the artist Yuli Ganf, a cartoonist, made a caption that said, "In this American restaurant, only one patron is served." And you see the world leaders bringing their plates and plates of dollars and francs and German marks, and feeding it all to the almost inhuman-looking war figure, while the people at the other tables are bereft. And I believe that Salman Rushdie was telling the truth when he said, those who are forcibly displaced by war are the shining shards that reflect the truth. And that is the truth of what our wars do to all of us, the truth of how desperate we are for a new way, for a way to put an end to war and to join the Afghan peacebuilders, whose banner, when they processed the first time, they had a public procession wearing the blue scarves that said border free and Bedune Mers on either end. Their banner said, "We want to abolish war." So may we follow in their footsteps, continue to learn from them, and always feel ever deepening gratitude for the mutually beneficial processes that happen as we welcome refugees and especially welcome their dreams. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. Another amazing presentation. And I think if we had this on Iraq, there would be a similar array of photos and names of people whose lives Kathy has touched. It is just amazing when we have meetings of our international group and Kathy can just relate to so many people on the planet. Thank you very much again, dear friend. Our first of the Afghan peacebuilders who will be profiled and will give their background, experience and what they are trying to achieve is Efat Abulfazil. And I said that earlier that this is crossing many time zones. Well, Efat is in Italy. I think it's probably about 1:50 a.m. in the morning. And so I said to Efat, look, it is an uncivilised hour. We'd be quite happy if you pre-recorded and we can show that because it was difficult. Efat was quite adamant. She said, no, I want to be part of this experience. And I think it just shows the grit and determination, the ability to transcend any obstacles. Because Efat is one of those proud, talented, courageous Afghan women, very much in the model of Sima Samar, whose talents are actually so desperately needed in contemporary Afghanistan, but who, outside of her homeland, has continued to do the work that she did while she was an Afghan peace builder in terms of women's rights, building equality, building strength and resilience. Efat is a social psychologist and peace advocate, and she was heading up the psychological services entity within the Afghan peacebuilders in Kabul, where she led programs supporting adult and child labourers and developed workshops promoting mental health awareness and non-violent relationships. She's also worked with Afghan women entrepreneurs through Begum Entrepreneurship, supporting economic empowerment and challenging restrictive gender norms. Her journey from Afghanistan took her through Russia, and she collaborated with the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, in organising and facilitating workshops for Afghan refugee women on gender-based violence, awareness, trauma support, stress management and self-care. Her work continues in terms of trying to strengthen resilience and community solidarity amongst displaced Afghan women. And Kathy mentioned the group worked across ethnic groups. It was Tajik, Hazara, Pashto, the lot. And in my conversations with Efat, she keeps on emphasising she just doesn't want to be working for the betterment of Hazara women. She wants it to be across ethnic boundaries. In Italy, Efat is continuing her tertiary studies that were interrupted in Afghanistan by the events of August 2021. And one of those studies in Kabul was fine arts. And in the last couple of days, I've been privileged to see some images of an art exhibition that Efat had in Brussels, and she's just recently returned from Brussels. She is quite a superb photographer, and she tries and continues to deepen her Afghan cultural roots, and she's currently mastering the playing of the tambura. So welcome, Efat. So wonderful to see you online rather than just the voice at the end of a telephone.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy I'm here. Well, like, before starting to tell you what I want to tell, I just want to say to Alan, like, in a minute, I see that, oh my God, I've done a lot, but still, it's just a drop in the river, I think. I know, like, I can carry you with me with the story that I had, and it's my only thing that I brought it from Afghanistan. It's my story. Well, back in Afghanistan, I was just a young girl, like 16 years old, that I joined the APV, Afghan Peace Volunteers. And oftenly after my school, I went there in the center, because in the Afghan Peace Volunteer Center, there was the different groups. And one of the groups that I was joining was the psychological group. And besides that I was young, besides that I came from a really prosperous family. And I think it was a privilege for me to come from such a family. Because Kathy, during her words, you mentioned how much the people of Afghanistan are struggling from different perspectives, from different issues. But me, as I come from such a family, I never countered those issues till when I get the chance to be part of the APV. And it was the first time as an Afghan girl back in Afghanistan, I see the real face of Afghanistan. Because before that, I was just going to school back home, school. It was the only two places that I know. And it was just because of insecurity and security issues back in Afghanistan. But when I willingly joined the APV at that time, like, I can say that it was a change point in my life. Because at that time, I started to know the reality of Afghanistan, to be with the children who are child labor. Besides that, we have a different definition for child labor and different from child street. Those who were coming in the center, they were both. They were child laborers and also child street. And we were working with them like a simple psychological support tools to tell them how they can how they can control their emotions, and try to tell them what is emotion, and kind of acknowledge them in some ways to how to move on on that tough situation of their life, especially in winter, even in Kabul, like Banyan, is much colder than Kabul, but it's still winter of Kabul is also a cruel winter. And I do remember that the children who came in the center, I once asked, well, we mostly have a handshaking with the children, and it was and once in the center, it was a really cold weather, but without snow. And I hold the hand of these children, and I told them that snow did not fall in the city, but snow fall in your hand. It's so cold. And for me, at that moment, that coldness was that much heavy that, like, in a second, my whole body would get frozen because it was so cold. And they were okay with that coldness. They were okay with that coldness, and they work on that coldness to just find a piece of bread for a day, or a meal for a day. Well, when I was 16 and I was a teenage, and I joined to the circle. There was 12 circles in the EPV. I was just searching for the meaning of peace, because my country was quite thirsty for the peace. And when I joined the EPV at that age, I thought the peace was something far away, something we had to reach, or something we had to bring it into Afghanistan from outside. But over the years, in EPV Center, after passing of the circles, and I can say that these circles truly changed my perspective, changed the way I see even the world. And I learned in the center that the peace is not coming from outside, it's coming from inside. And it was the beginning that I become quite more active in the psychological theme back in APV. And we began to help the children and also other young Afghans who came to the center for simple tools. I know that I do remember that even there was a little girl that comes and tell me that we were just talking about what is emotions, and she came and asked me that about happiness. And she asked it, you know what's happiness? And I say, do you know what's happiness? And she asked me, for me, happiness is to be happy and do not work. And I do still remember that word, to play, or to be here but not to work. And on that time, as I realized that I cannot give them anything, but I can give them that inner peace, give them that love and hope. And it was my work in the center to give them this love, hope, and also to give them the tools that we learned from Capacitor, was another organization that collaborated with us back in Kabul. And I met Dr. Patricia Pat, the director of the Capacitor. And she was a really kind, and her dedication deeply kind of touched my life, that I decided to study psychology. On that, when I was in the APV, I was become a listener. But after that period, I said I want to be a listener, but from the perspective of knowledge, not to be a simple listener, not be a simpler helper. I want to be a helper, but from the perspective of knowledge. And luckily, I get the chance to go to Moscow to study psychology. And in my third year, we present our project to UNHCR of Moscow to have the same sessions that we had in APV, to acknowledge them about their emotion and give them love and hope. And it was, I think it was my first academic activity that I've done with UNHCR back in Moscow. And on that sessions, I met with Afghan refugees in the 4 cities of Russia. We had this sessions, and the refugees who came to these sessions was also seekers of hope. That's why they were there. And we gave them this tool and help them to redefine their identity, because they were more struggling about that, who they are. They are not fully Afghan anymore, and they are not fully Russian anymore. They can't be fully Russian. And it was like a most difficult experience for them, especially as a refugee, to leave one home and not yet feel at home. And especially for the first generation of refugees. And I think identity becomes a constant question for them, that who they are and where they belong. And as a student of social psychology, it was the only thing that I can do for them, to train them and acknowledge them about their emotions, about helping them to adjust to the society and accept their selves. It's so difficult for refugees, especially that they carry for so long so many traumas, so many fears, so many anger with them from the whole journey of their life, And I was just trying to help them to leave that, leave that huge and heavy courage that they carry for so long. It was the only thing that I can do for them on that moment. And because most of the women who came on our sessions faced violence, and also as they have the experience of war, and they become double for them, and it become kind of a trauma for them. And but for the tools that I learned from Capacitor back in APV, we give them the tool and we help them to heal. And I just, in Moscow, I realized that peace is not only absence of war. It is the presence of dignity. It is feeling of belonging, and its ability to live without fear, both inside ourselves and the world around us. And as we are in the week of refugees, I want to finish my word about them, about us, because I'm also a refugee now. I want to tell that no one wants to leave home. And refugees do not choose departure. They choose to survive. And I hope that one day I get the chance to go back to Afghanistan and find a chance also to serve for humanity. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Efat. That was so powerful. Thank you so much. If people wish to have questions, would they please put them into the chat? Would they please put them into the chat? And we will deal with them in the panel session. So we're going to take a short break here now, and then we'll have two further Afghan peace builders, Dr. Mujib Abid and Nemat Ahangosh. And after that, there will be a panel session, and we will deal with all the questions we can get through that are in the chat. So thank you very much. We're going to have a small break here, and we'll be back very soon. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. In this part of the symposium, we're profiling two more of the Afghan peace builders. The first one is Dr. Mujib Abid. And Mujib is one of those powerful, courageous, natural leaders that have been lost to Afghanistan. He was one of the early Afghan peace builders, and it was his skill and expertise that helped fashion the longevity of that group. Mujib is extremely courageous. In August 2021, when people were fleeing Kabul, Mujib actually flew in. There's probably not time to tell of his somewhat animated telephone conversation with Barnaby Joyce, then Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, except that Mujib prevailed in that conversation. Mujib is a much credentialed academic with a BA from the American University of Afghanistan, a master's degree in peace and conflict studies from the University of Sydney, and a PhD from the University of Queensland. In Australia, Mujib has forged a significant role as a scholar of modern Afghan history, peace studies and political theory. Mujib is the author of a forthcoming book, Resurgent Histories of Afghanistan, which examines modernist power and politics of dissent in Afghanistan. It's a conceptually sophisticated book that builds on Mujib's comprehensive grasp of a range of academic and intellectual traditions, including decolonial and post-colonial studies, as well as traditional and Islamic knowledge perspectives. These are drawn together to draw a nuanced story of Afghan responses to colonial pressures influenced by the geo-historical location of Afghanistan. Mujib is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Initiative for Peacebuilding at the University of Melbourne. His ongoing research includes an examination of the social and cultural dimensions of the post-2001 Australian involvement in the war on terror and state-building regimes in Afghanistan, including the experience of migration and involuntary displacement. Mujib is co-founder of the Salam Centre for Dialogue and a co-facilitator of the Intra-Afghan Dialogue in Australia. Mujib is highly collegiate and a wonderful and loyal friend.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Alan. That's a very generous introduction, I should say. Thank you. And I welcome this opportunity to reflect a little bit on what I call diasporic peace building here in Australia, especially from an Afghan perspective. Now, as we delve into this conversation, I like to first start by highlighting a couple of key concepts, and we will return to these concepts later on as I continue through my talk. We do know that peace building is best pursued when we locate ourselves in more than one cultural location. And really what I mean by that is when we locate ourselves in more than one place at a time. Now, migrants or diaspora communities, inherently, they occupy more than one cultural location at a time. This is called by many names in scholarly circles, but the two concepts that I like to highlight from the get-go. One is cultural hybridity or cultural intermixing, right? Migrants are hybrid creatures, culturally speaking, in terms of identity. They navigate and traverse borders and artificial boundaries that create nation states and that create different, societies with different levels of privilege and resourcefulness. And so there is a lot of literature on what cultural hybridity means and how immigrants are sort of bridges that connect cultures by virtue of who they are. Another concept is multi-identitedness. So how migrants are multi-identity. What that means is that they, at any one given time, get to wear multiple hats. They get to have multiple identities. And in terms of how to prioritize or how to organize their different identities, they respond to the sort of contingencies of any situation, right? They get to sort of be Afghan here, they get to be Australian there, they get to be American there. Sometimes they mix and match. And this is more than just sort of code switching, which is perhaps a little more negative and out of necessity. Both this cultural hybridity and this multi-identity sort of cultural perspective of migrants, it should be seen as an advantage. It's what sets migrants apart. It's also what really makes them so resourceful when it comes to improving the social relations and or really not just improving, but reimagining social relations, both in their adoptive homes, especially in the Western world, but also sort of back home from the places of origin where they come from. And and really how that happens, why that happens, because they get to have access, migrants get to have access to multiple, cultural reference points at one go. So what they do is they critique either of the two or multiple cultural locations with reference to one another, right? And so I just want to highlight that the migrants, by virtue of who they are sort of, and they are a net positive to the societies that they sort of, end up, migrating to or traveling to, and sort of then embarking on this really challenging journey of restarting life. Now, as I say that, I want to kind of refer to some examples, perhaps, to give this a little more of a concrete edge. Now, recently, I've moved to Melbourne. It's only been a little under 2 years, and I've gotten to experience not one but two Eid festivals here. There's a beautiful event that happens every Eid. And as part of the Eid Fest, which is organized by a beautiful committee of Muslim and non-Muslim activists and community organizers, we have a free concert of Qawwali music, and of all places in the heart of the city at Federation Square. And I just love this because I'm a Sufi deep down, and I love Sufi mystic music. But initially in 2024, when I saw this, I have to be honest, I was kind of shocked. And at Federation Square, a free concert by Farid Ayaz and Abu Muhammad, who are like the foremost Qawwali troupe of the subcontinent, if you ask me. And they just keep doing it. They did it 2 years in a row. And so a critical cultural theorist would say, well, this is exactly what migrants do. Look, they are exposing an Australian audience to a type of devotional, rather unique music that comes to us from the subcontinent that otherwise they wouldn't have access to. But in the audience, you can see there's everybody enjoying and nodding along and really being, some of them being in this sort of total state of trance. Now, the inverse of that's true as well. Anybody who is a lover of Bollywood music, let's say, in the subcontinent, we do know that there is this migration and movement has brought about a lot of the beautiful Western musical traditions into the subcontinent that otherwise, without migrants traveling and traversing across borders, that wouldn't have been possible. We have the likes of A.R. Rahman, who seamlessly brings together Eastern and Western musical traditions, absolutely pioneering, right? The different orchestration, the different instruments. He's amazing. This man is a genius. He's a musical genius, right? But it actually goes to perhaps more contentious issues as well, including peacebuilding. And this is where I want to reflect a little bit on my own encounters and experiences with the APVs, the group that we all who have gathered here either have been associated with or know of and admire in our own ways. And I want to travel a little back in time. In 2013, I had just migrated to Australia. Well, I just come to Australia as a student, really, to do my master's in peace and conflict studies at the University of Sydney. And by then, I was really disenchanted with what the West was trying to do in Afghanistan, what the whole project was. I had worked in the Afghan government, which had exposed me to this sort of power dynamics between the Americans and the Western, soldiers and civilians and contractors. That power dynamic that they shared, and really the privilege that they had, and especially the sort of dominated dynamic that I often found between the Afghan and the outsider. To me, by 2013, I was convinced that this is nothing more than a colonial exercise that was being masqueraded as something else, as a project for liberation and so on and so forth. And so I was really genuinely very disenchanted with the whole project, even though I had come from within that system. I was very much product of that state-building regime. You mentioned the American University of Afghanistan. I had studied at the premier higher education institution that the Americans had funded. It was a big, important project for them to produce the next generation of Afghan leaders. But I kind of lashed out, I think by year 2, year 3, I kind of lashed out against the whole project. To me, you know, a materialist socialist critique made much more sense than the capitalist neoliberal project that they were selling us. But of course, that also wasn't enough. And it's around this time, really, I mean, the timing of it couldn't have been more perfect, that I was introduced to the APVs in Kabul. And a couple of months later, so I immediately set up a meeting, and I met these wonderful people. And truly, from the get-go, this is an inspiring movement. I mean, this is something that I couldn't believe my eyes. In the heart of Kabul, it's one thing to see it in Newtown in Sydney, right? But to see it emanating from this voice of reason and compassion and nonviolence emanating from Bamiyan or from Kabul, to me it was an eye-opening experience. It was deeply inspiring from the very get-go. But then a couple of months later, around March, if I'm not mistaken, 2014, I went to Kabul, and by then I had written this little essay on Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan for one of my classes here at Sydney University. And I asked the great Dr. Hakim, I said, is there anything, I want to come I want to know you, I want to see what this, the APVs are all about, I want to come see the center, I want to see the young people, but is there anything you want me to do? And he said, do you want to, let's organize a sort of like a one-day workshop, and let's have you talk to them. And I said, well, I have this paper, I'm going to come talk to you. But as soon as I entered, I remember this is around Demazang, between Demazang and Kortechar, this beautiful little oasis, this corner, this exceptional space that they had carved up against all odds, going against the grain. As soon as you entered it, on the walls, there is Gandhiji, there is Martin Luther King's photo, there is Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, and the language that went along with that. There is a certain austerity to the center, there's a certain humbleness to it all, but there is also a certain cultural and discursive richness that you can't quite quantify. And it was visible and it was palpable from the moment I entered into this space. And ever since then, I looked at APVs and my association with the APV, with young people, with Hakim, with the international supporters, who I came to know ever since by visiting the Bay Area in the US, by going to Washington State, by meeting folks here in Australia, meeting folks in Singapore. But more than anything else, every time I was in Kabul, I made a point of spending quality time at the center. And over the years, the Global Days of Listening to Me was an important, regular space that as much as possible, I didn't want to miss. We tried to get an Institute for Studies of Nonviolence off the ground, which I worked for years with friends like Basir, like Masuma, like Hakim himself. I remember going to the Ministry of Education, trying to convince them to give us the license to operate. But there was all types of pushback and challenges, and they couldn't quite make sense of it. What do you mean permaculture? What do you mean nonviolence? What is this language? Are you teaching people economics? Are you teaching people agriculture? What is this, right? Again, this speaks to how unique and how courageous APVs was and continues to be, how exceptional it was. All around that, there was the dominant discourses to be in Kabul was of war, of carnage, of revenge. Here is a group of people who transcended all of that. They would speak of nonviolence, they would speak of environmental justice, they would speak of communal care, and they did something about it. And I should also point this out, something else that I think APVs had cracked quite early on, and to me it was very evident, was this balance between the local and the global. They were so attuned to the realities, the imperatives of life in Kabul. I mean, both Kati spoke of the various campaigns and initiatives. It was really to help at the material, personal level, because that help was needed. That disadvantage was there. You couldn't overlook that. And and yet the initiative as a whole was so well connected. It was such a beautiful network of courageous and really inspiring peace builders who spoke about peace and approached peace building from different registers. But that's the beauty of it, right? Cultural, like I said, peace building is best approached when we decenter it, when we speak to it from multiple cultural locations. Now, I also know that, August 2021 happened, and I know that a lot of APVs, unfortunately, are scattered around the world. And not that I'm trying to, bring about the resolution, or I'm in a position to really resolve this, but I know that within the movement there have been tensions. What do you do in this moment, in this flashpoint of sorts, where the space to function is really shrinking? Do you move elsewhere and continue operating, or do you double down now that the call to action is even more pronounced and even more animated? I'm not trying to, I don't know what the answer to that is, but the reality that we're dealing with is that whether it's North America, whether it is Europe, from Portugal all the way to UK, where Nemat's from, Italy, where Efat was just speaking to us beautifully from, whether it's here in Australia, the regional countries around Pakistan, I hear of South America, who knows, and then those of the APVs who are still back home. But the people are scattered, these volunteers are scattered. And now the task is, how do you sustain the mission? How do you continue to do this important work against certain forces that might try to discipline our politics, our worldviews? This kind of contrarian politics that, to me, should be at the core of any effective, critical peace-building work. Which I often read that in the APVs, that their optimism within it was also a certain critical bent, a certain realism, right? That they were not, if they would critique, this is what the beauty of it was, that they could hold a critique that was double-edged. They would critique Western imperialism and really what the war on terror was, and the destruction and carnage that project subjected millions of Afghans to. But they could also critique the fundamentalists and radical forces within the country, right? That they could also transcend the sort of rather basic and rather reductionist domestic politics that often could not escape the trappings of identity politics and language and this and that, right? Now, doing peace-building work for Afghans in Australia, you have to, and I've been interviewing people since the beginning of last year, and I'm trying to understand some of these questions. What does it mean to be an Afghan peace builder? What does it mean to harbor a type of politics that does not quite align with the dominant discourses and narratives here in Australia? Now, there are two specific things that a lot of Afghans, I think here in Australia, if I can speak to this particular location, they are forced to grapple with. On the one hand, Australia is notorious for its really heartless, really violent refugee and asylum seeker policies, especially going back to the inauguration of the new coalition government in 2012-2013. They sort of overhauled the whole humanitarian program. And at the time they announced the Operation Sovereign Border. Those of us who were in Kabul, I recently was talking to somebody, they could still recall the terribly Orwellian advert campaign that they ran in Kabul saying Australia will never be your home, and they were showing these extremely violent capsizing boats without a worry about what it would do to the millions of people that we are subjecting to our sort of anxious, our fearful attitude to the other, right? Of course, not a small minority of Afghans even then were thinking about Australia. It's not that Australia is a place that's within the horizons of many Afghans, but it didn't matter. It's not about them, it's about us. So the first thing is Australia's securitized border regimes. That what it does is it looks at an Afghan asylum seeker, and it prefigures a certain role and a certain identity and casts that image onto them, right? If you were a Hazara and you come to Australia, there is already a certain bell. There's already a certain set of descriptions and qualities. And instead of hearing your story, your name is plastered onto this sort of package, and then that's who you are. If you are a Pashtun woman, then there's a certain, like the same thing happens. If you have had a certain experience, the authenticity of your narrative doesn't really matter as much. It's already the officer working for the Home Affairs already has a certain narrative that they have internalized, and they're going to look at you like that. The problem is that going through this process, that hybridity, that cultural hybridity that I was talking at the beginning, that multi-identityness of the immigrant, which is what sets them apart, which is the type of advantage that they will have, which is a resource towards betterment of our society here, as well as societies out there, and here, out there, we kind of erase that. We run the risk of erasing that because we turn multidimensional, deeply complex, deeply critical individuals who can be a resource to our society, we turn them into unidimensional, really simple, simple renditions of them. These are just who look at the world in binaries, black and white, good or bad, right? So that's one. The other thing is the type of sort of, so there is the policy, and then there is the cultural side of this. And here too, an immigrant who, especially a refugee, which is the absolute majority of Afghans in Australia, they come through the humanitarian program, right? Either directly or indirectly, but most of us have either been asylum seekers at one point or refugees, or children of refugees, refugee parents. The problem is that we have internalized in Australia this logic of the grateful refugee. Now, gratefulness on its own, there's nothing wrong with that. It's a beautiful thing. Of course, as human beings, we ought to be grateful. It's one of the things about being a nonviolent peace activist. But when we take that this moniker of the grateful migrant, and we turn it then into an expectation of being apolitical, or switching, changing your language, changing your grammar. Stop looking at the world the way you're looking at it back when you were wherever you come from. Start looking at the world from our lens only, exclusively, right? That again, and it happens, I see it all around me. It's a way of, unfortunately, inadvertently, it once again erases. It runs the risk of erasing that type of rich cultural hybridity that ultimately I think is going to be the tool, or that these are people who have the tools to help us address some of our most pressing existential problems, but also our everyday challenges. So look, I'll finish on this, Alan. I don't want to go on and on too much, but I think Afghan peace builders in Australia, it is a challenge. There are demands put upon us to assimilate. As much as, again, I'm going to repeat myself here, the type of cultural hybridity that immigrants are a reminder of, that they embody, is it goes hand in hand with the multicultural Australia's ethos and commitments and worldview. But it's one thing to say something and claim that we're committed to in practice. There are still all types of demands of assimilation. As this country has had white Australia policy, and we're still dealing with the legacies of that and the broader, subtler colonial logics that is kind of quite, unfortunately, present and visible. But I'll finish on this. Afghan diasporic peacebuilders, they navigate these complex waters where the demands for assimilation are always present, but they do it with dignity. They do it with compassion, and I think they, time and again, I am amazed through the work that I do with the university, through the work that I do beyond the university. I'm amazed at the resilience, at the capacity to not conform. Conformity is not going to help us here. That they harbor the type of language, and they do it sometimes improvisationally, sometimes they do it with a lot of care, sometimes they have to do it with a lot of evasiveness, because otherwise you will be subjected to treatment that might not be so nice, cruel treatment, isolation, pushed to the margins. And of course we have our own challenges as well to deal with. But despite all the challenges, cultural, material, disciplinary, in terms of policy, in terms of the mainstream society's expectations, especially around gratefulness, the grateful migrant is romanticized here. I find that Afghans time and again transcend all of that and still call for better reimagined social relations, for social justice. They still continue to call for human rights. And that's my hope going forward for APVs, that despite being subjected to this cruel process of involuntary displacement, and like Efat was talking about, there is all types of mixed feelings about that. There is, beyond anything else, the hope of a return, the right of a return. It's very much alive. But my hope for APVs is, and my reading of APVs for right now, and my hope going into the future is that they will continue to harbor that type of unique, exceptional politics that speaks back against the eye of power at every chance it gets. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Mujib. That was extremely powerful. It was extremely nuanced. And I think it's the debate that is absolutely essential in Australia, where we have now been subsumed by this nativist populism of, according to Australian values, whatever that can possibly mean. I thank you so much for that. There is obviously so many issues coming up. If people wish to explore them and have them pulled out in the panel session, please enter the questions into the chat. We've had two extremely powerful presentations from the Afghan peacebuilders, and we're now going to go on to a third. And so we have here from the UK who had to experience some of the jumping through the hoops of home affairs and the like, where I think there was racial stereotyping at play. And so we have Nematullah Ahangosh, known to everybody as Nemat, who is an Afghan activist, a poet, with a particular interest, for obvious reasons, as having been born with muscular dystrophy, in the concerns of a subset of refugees that can often be overlooked, the subset of refugees who have a disability. And Nemat's writings reflect the themes of resilience and hope and the hardships of Afghan society, and often touch on the ravages of war. And I think Nemat will give insights in his presentation to the Afghan peacebuilder experience, and also of what he is creating in terms of an NGO. So Nemat pursued higher education in India, where he earned a bachelor's degree at the Madras School of Social Work, which was supported by a scholarship from Jesuit Refugee Service. And I'm delighted that a couple of Nemat's supporters from Jesuit Refugee Services are actually online here. After that, Nemat went to Kerala and earned, interestingly, a certificate in entrepreneurship. And his further studies in India were curtailed when his application for refugee status brought him to the UK. Nemat is extremely self-effacing and modest. However, with every conversation I have with him, I learn something new, such as when he came to the UK and was being processed for his refugee claim, he was put up in a refugee hostel, which was actually a hotel. And on his own initiative, he, in the foyer of the hotel, sets up an information bureau. And here he is with his command of English, his emergent knowledge of the British bureaucracy, is providing a in-house shop for people filling out forms, giving advice, getting them established elsewhere. So I think over to you, Nemat.
Thank you, Alan. It's been a few years that I have been a refugee, because apparently becoming a refugee has become fashionable. But unfortunately, I do not recommend the experience. Anyway, roughly 12 years ago, in Kabul, Afghanistan, when I was much younger than now, I came across a group of young people who believed that there should be no war in the world. And I remember thinking, what happened to these people? Have they completely lost their minds? What a crazy group of people. Because when you grow up in a war-stricken country, peace sounds unrealistic, equality sounds dangerous, and nonviolence almost sounds like a joke, which is actually the psychology of war. So many of these young people came from Bamiyan in central Afghanistan, where the residents, particularly the Hazaras, were repeatedly massacred and targeted by the Taliban and other extremist regimes since the 19th century. The Hazaras are an ethnic minority in Afghanistan that once formed the majority in the country, but endured repeated waves of violence and persecutions, which many historians and activists describe this as genocide. Also, the cultural heritage of that area is not just the Hazaras, but different ethnic groups was attacked by the Taliban, like the Buddhas of Bamiyan in 2001. And of course, other minorities experienced similar violence too. But what always stayed with me was this contradiction. From a place associated with distractions emerged a movement trying to imagine nonviolence. As you can see in the picture, so instead of responding with to violence with more violence, these young people, they built the Bamiyan Peace Park, and also began to promote the idea of a green, equal, and nonviolent world without war. So if you have the next slide, what made the movement special was its diversity. Young people came from different ethnic backgrounds and social backgrounds. Later, when the Afghan peacebuilders moved to Kabul, I joined them one day after school at an event where the children gathered and they were breaking these toys, which were like guns and all sorts of violent, like military stuff that were toys. So they were breaking this and then burying them, and on top of that planting trees. I think Kathy also showed some of these pictures. So later that area became a green space. So this was during a time when I was at school, and so I joined other teenagers. Most of these Afghan peacebuilders, we were teenagers, and that's how we also work with other teenage groups and street kids, child laborers actually. And for the first time in my life, I found myself building deep friendships across ethnic lines, which once before our ancestors were fighting each other in Afghan civil war. But that was for me quite moving, because I was able to make friends with different people, different ethnic groups that previously I didn't know that these ethnic groups were in the countries. Mm-hmm. And even across borders, I built really good friendships. Being among the fellow activists, I learned a lot. For example, violence is not only what we imagine. For example, fighting, abuse, or people hurting each other directly, sometimes it is softer and quieter, but as devastating. Like when the Buddhas of Bamyan were destroyed in 2001, which erased a whole, parts of our history. So whatever the form, the youth taught me that violence always finds a way, an excuse, but it has never resolved anything. If you have the next slide, please. So these fearless young people taught me lessons the hard way, and somehow, despite my initial doubts, later I found myself to become part of this crazy group. So war does not only shape what happens outside, but also shapes what happens inside people's mind. When you grow up in war, fear becomes normal, and survival becomes the main goal, and force starts to look like the only language that works, and violence slowly stops feeling exceptional. It becomes part of our everyday life. One more thing that really stayed with me was that even under bombs, people still were imagining peace, like the Afghan peacebuilders. I was not only learning about nonviolence from distant experts or foreign voices, but also from teenagers, from young people around me in Afghanistan. And I'd like to mention that in many ways, the Afghan peacebuilders were teaching peace to the world, not just learning from Martin Luther King or Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan. So the idea of nonviolence which promoted was something that really taught many Afghans different ways of looking at the world and having different lenses, that you could see the world and how it works. So we dreamed a world without borders, and history scattered us when the government collapsed in Afghanistan. So we were, as Mujib mentioned, we went across different borders, and suddenly the dream that we once dreamed, that we want to build a world without war, without any borders, we suddenly become our own dreams. So in moments like this, when war becomes normal, when people are scattered, and when you're left carrying the dreams that feel too heavy to hold on to alone, I often return to words that express something deeper than analysis. So I'd like to read a poem by a Palestinian-American poet, Suhair Hamad, that speaks to that refusal, the refusal to be pulled into the logic of war, even when it is totally surrounding you. What I will not dance to your war drum. I will not lend my soul nor my bones to your war drum. I will not dance to your beating. I know that beat. It is lifeless. I know intimately that skin you're hitting. It was alive once, hunted, stolen, stretched. I will not dance to your drummed up war. I will not pop, spin, break for you. I will not hate for you or even hate you. I will not kill for you, especially I will not die for you. I will not mourn the dead with murder nor suicide. I will not side with you nor dance to bombs because everyone else is dancing. Everyone can be wrong. Life is a right, not collateral or casual. I will not forget where I come from. I will craft my own drum, gather my beloved near, and our chanting will be dancing, our humming will be drumming. I'll not be played. I will not lend my name nor my rhythm to your beating. I will dance and resist and dance and persist and dance. This heartbeat is louder than death. Your war drum and louder than these breaths. So that's the end of the poem. Just to mention that same ideas that I learned, the same things that I learned at the center of these Afghan peacebuilders, years later I realized that the same ideas like dignity, courage, and refusing to accept limits imposed by fear were shaping another journey in my life, which is the work of Stretch Moore. So, can we have the second slide, please? Thank you. Well, growing up with muscular dystrophy, I understood how easily people can be defined by what we cannot do. Yet I also knew that disability doesn't mean inability. As I reflected on my own experiences and on what I have learned from people working for peace in Afghanistan, I was constantly thinking about this. I was thinking, where are the disabled people and what happens to us during crisis? Next slide, please. Probably you have seen these images coming out of the Kabul International Airport in 2021 when the Taliban took over for the second time and the NATO-backed government collapsed. It felt as if the whole population of Kabul came to the airport to be evacuated because they were so scared of the second rule of the Taliban. I was watching this news from India where I was studying, which I was shocked and I didn't know what to do. But I also was thinking about disabled people like myself, like how are they coping with the fear? Like where are they? Like everybody came to the airport, but where are the disabled people? So after that airport incidents, there were many incidents, of course, many people were killed, not just by the Taliban, but by the explosions from the NATO troops there. So that was something that if you're outside and you are disabled, you might be thinking that, what if I was in that situation? What would I do? Like, would I be just under people's feet? Everybody would walk with me? Because for people with disabilities, mobility is the main issue. Whether it's a flood, an earthquake, or a conflict, we are often among the most vulnerable groups. We may not receive information in accessible formats. We might not have evacuation plans. We might depend on others for survival. For me, of course, this is not just a question of safety, but of dignity. Too often we are treated as passive recipients of help. Society assumes that we need to be rescued rather than empowered, actually. Yet I believe there was another way. Next slide, please. At the same time, I came across the story of Michael Hingson, who was a blind man, who is still a blind man, and also a survivor of the September 11 attack in New York. So together with his dog, Russell, they were in the 78th floor of the North Tower. So together they managed to evacuate the building, and on their way they took many other people with them along the way, both helped others who were disoriented by smoke and confusion. Because if you're blind, you already have experienced this your whole life, so you know how to navigate through through situations like that. So the story challenged a common assumption here. In a crisis, disabled people are not always the ones being helped. Sometimes we are the people who help others. The difference is often, of course, the preparation, confidence, and opportunity. So this belief led me to establish Stretchmore. And next slide, please. So Stretchmore was founded on a simple idea. Instead of waiting until a disaster happens and then responding, why not prepare disabled people beforehand? Why not equip ourselves with skills, confidence, and experience we need to navigate difficult situations independently? Why Stretchmore? And what does it mean? Well, for us it means challenging limitations, building confidence, and developing the skills we need to live the life we want, but also to stay safe and survive in times of crisis. Whether it's learning new skills, taking on new challenges, or preparing for disasters, we believe that stretching beyond our comfort zones can be life-changing, and in some cases it becomes life-saving. Since the establishment of the organization, we are empowering disabled people through our life-saving camps. The camps are designed to challenge assumptions about disability and to help participants discover strengths they may never have had the opportunity to explore. So my team and I started training disabled people in areas prone to disasters, although in the future we aim to, once we gain the expertise and the skills, we also want to cover conflict areas. But we are a fairly new organization and recently registered in England with the Charity Commission of England and Wales. So the training takes place in 3 phases. If you have the next slide, please. Right, so the first, if we go one slide back, please. I think I think that's the right slide. So the first is sports and adventure. Participants learn activities such as swimming, boating, hiking, climbing, and balancing, because like when you are in developing countries, not in wealthy countries, not everybody knows how to swim, and disabled people not knowing how to swim in many countries and they drown. So because the parents are overprotective and they may not have opportunities to learn. So we teach all these survival skills. And for many people, these activities may seem ordinary, but for participants, they represent the first time they have been encouraged to step beyond their limits, which again imposed by fear and society. So that is a short video of the first camp that we did in 2022 in Kerala, southern part of India. So if we could play that.
My name is Nibin Matthew.
Hi, I'm Abulfazil.
Namaskaram. And Anish.
Myself, Dinesh. It's been 6 days. I am part of this life-saving camp. If I learned freestyle swimming, and from today onwards, I'm learning breaststroke.
I have practiced shutdown and first aid such as sprains, bleeding, puncture wounds, and bites and stings.
തന്നെ എൻ്റെ അച്ഛൻ മരിക്കുന്നത് 2012 മരിക്കുന്നത് കാർഡിയാക് അറസ്റ്റ് വന്നിട്ടാണ്. ആ ഒരു സിറ്റുവേഷനിൽ ഒരുപക്ഷെ CPR കൊടുക്കാൻ എനിക്ക് കഴിയുമായിരുന്നെങ്കിൽ, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ CPR കൊടുക്കാൻ എനിക്ക് അറിയാമായിരുന്നെങ്കിൽ ഒരുപക്ഷെ രക്ഷപ്പെടും എന്ന് ഇപ്പം എനിക്ക് തോന്നുന്നുണ്ട്. പക്ഷേ
So I feel it is very, very important to have this kind of training program for person with disability. So that's the reason that I joined for this course.
Right, so the second area focuses on survival skills. So participants learn skills like water safety and shelter making and fishing, and how to go after food when a disaster strikes, when there is nothing, how you're going to survive, how you filter water, for example, during this time. So we have another slide, another video, short video, that shows our life-saving camp in 2023, which we focus mainly on swimming, but also on other skills. So if you have the next slide, please. Right, so the last stage of our training, our life-saving camps, involve leadership and communication skills, which I have learned the communication skills, much about non-violent communication skills from the Afghan peacebuilders back in Afghanistan. So we have that part of our program, which is non-violent communication and conflict resolution. They also learn about teamwork. So the goal is not simply to help survive crisis, but to help them become active contributors within their own communities. What we have learned is that the greatest transformation is not actually physical, it is psychological. Many participants arrive believing there are things that they simply cannot do. They leave having faced their fears, spoken confidently in front of a group, entered deep water for the first time, or taken responsibility for helping others. Next slide, please. So in 2022, we organized our first life-saving camp in Kerala, India, with only 4 blind participants. We were actually piloting our project, but in 2023, we expanded the program to 10 participants, including people with different physical disabilities. And that was again in Kerala, southern part of India. And the pictures that you can see, they are from different life-saving camps, and The first three pictures are from Life Saving Camp 2025, which was last year in Kathmandu, Nepal. And the last picture is from Life Saving Camp 2022. So in 2025, we have expanded our participants, and we had 17 blind and partially sighted participants, and the camp was we hosted the camp in Kathmandu, Nepal, with another organization called Blind Rocks, which they are really active in Nepal. Also, we have successfully registered our organization last year, and in 2026 we are aiming for a life-saving camp in Uganda, where we plan to train 20 participants who are having different disabilities, just physical disabilities and sensories, not any mental issues, because we don't have the experience. And the feedback we have received from the previous camps, it was powerful. The participants reported increased confidence, greater independence, and a strong belief in their own abilities. And their families, who had been overprotective, began to see new possibilities for their loved ones. Next slide, please. Right, and our organization, Stretchmore, is an award-winning organization. So we have won awards from F Social Impact Prize in 2025 in Germany, and in 2024, where I was studying at the University of Sussex in Southeast England, we won a prize called Startup Sussex Social Impact Award, which recognized our work for our previous camps. So for me, these camps represent more than a project. They are a continuation of the lessons I learned years ago in Afghanistan. And peacebuilding is not only about ending violence, it is about creating conditions in which people can realize their potential and participate fully in the society. In the same way, disability inclusion is not about providing support, it is about recognizing capability, creating opportunity, and ensuring that people are not defined by their limitations. And that is what Stretchmore seeks to do, and our vision is simple. A world where disabled people are not merely protected during crisis, but are prepared, empowered, and able to lead. And finally, this is where I stop talking and let the conversation begin. Thank you.
Thank you, Nemat. And we're going to bring this all together further. I hope there are questions coming through in the chat. And we are going to go into a panel session, so it'll be a short break while we bring in the host for that. It is Dale Hess, who's the treasurer of World Beyond War, but somebody who has for a long time been a strong supporter of the Afghan Peacebuilder network. After that, we are going to have poetry, because in my introduction to Nemat, and his last slide showed the prizes that his NGO had won. Nemat also won first prize in the 2023 Frederick Douglass Writing Competition, and his book of poems, The Colour of Peace, for which he'll be reading two poems from, was published last year by Haley's in the US, to very wide acclaim, including by Alicia Stallings, who's the Oxford University Professor of Poetry, who arranged for Nemat to give a reading of his poems at Oxford. So we will take a short break now. We'll be back with the panel, and following that we will have the poetry from Nemat and from Nazila.
Welcome back, friends. I'd like to acknowledge that we are living and working here on Aboriginal land, indigenous land that has been cared for over the millennia. We acknowledge their elders past, present, and emerging. This is a short panel session, friends, where we want to have a chance to reflect on some of the topics that we've been thinking about today. And I'd like to start off with Mujib and ask him just what does it mean to be a peace worker in a context of war and violence, knowing that you may be suffering in the cause of peace?
Thank you very much, Dale. Look, going all the way back to when I was a undergraduate student in Kabul, I think the cause of peace, because it was, in Farsi we say pesh pay aftada, because it was such a non-issue in the height of war. Kathy earlier mentioned the surge, the Obama surge. That's when I was sort of like an 18, 19-year-old boy when the Obama surge was announced, and over 110,000 American troops all of a sudden found themselves in Afghanistan, supported by 30, 40K additional troops from other countries, including Australia. I knew all along that it wasn't going to be an easy journey. Going against the grain is never easy, but nobody has ever said that peace, struggling for peace, seeking peace, speaking in a language of nonviolence and pacifism was ever going to be easy in a world that's defined by nation states, in a world that's defined by boundaries, by difference. And somehow we have come to learn, and I want to point this out, as a legacy of colonialism in the rest of the world, in Africa and Latin America and Asia, as much as in the West, in Europe and America itself, we have learned to learn and have come to be expected to champion difference in that sense. The idea of nation states is about championing difference, and all of us feeling special, and we are so unique. But the reality is we are not. We are all one and the same, or we are in on this together. But to speak of peace, to speak of nonviolence in this world that we find ourselves in, it was never going to be easy. But I personally was okay with that. Growing up in Kabul in Afghanistan in the 90s, when Afghanistan saw the worst of Islamic radicalism clash and permeate through everyday life in Afghanistan, when I was a 6th grade school student, 5th grade, 6th grade school student, under the first Taliban emirate in Kabul. And then 9/11, the terrorist attacks happened. Afghanistan was kind of pushed back onto the Western global consciousness. But that re-entry was not necessarily managed in a way that really centered the Afghan victimhood, right? The Afghan condition. It was more about seeking revenge. It was more about doing something to correct what 9/11 was. Afghanistan, as somebody, a brilliant scholar in Canada has pointed out, Afghanistan, the place and its people came to replace the non-territoriality of Al-Qaeda. We didn't know where to locate Al-Qaeda. Where is this territory? It's a non-state actor. We don't know. It's a bit of an enigma. But Afghanistan could replace it. These are the sort of two, and post 9/11 Afghanistan, to me, saw the most volcanic and the most violent aspects of Western republicanism permeate and be experienced by millions of, my generation and my countrymen and women. And I knew that this is not right. Neither is the Islamic radicalism of the 90s, nor is this Western fundamentalism that's now being repackaged and somehow sold to us as liberation and freedom. Something is deeply wrong with it. The bombing campaigns, the killing. And for me, I'm going to finish on this, Dale. I grew up in Kabul, but my family is not from Kabul. We have deep connections to the country, a little province in the south of Kabul. It's a rural area. And that place from about 2005, 2006 turned into a hotbed of insurgency, and eventually they took over. By 2007, we were banned essentially from going back to my birthplace. So we were kind of pushed to make do with what Kabul was and not beyond that. But anyway, what that meant for me was a constant reminder, just through the vines, through family relations, visitors from the country. But my mother and my sister, when she was growing up, they were the only people from my family who could go back because they were the burqa somehow gave them, in a bizarre way, a bit of protection. But they would come back with stories of suffering, of carnage, of what the Taliban were doing to the people, but also what the Americans were doing to the people, what the Afghan government was doing to the people. And none of that was wrong. And I had to commit myself to the cause of peace and speaking in a different grammar and a different language. And I was always happy with the consequences of that. It comes with a cost, but it's okay.
Oh, thank you. Nemat, we'll turn to you, and I would like to hear from your experience, just what it means to be a peace worker in a time of war and violence, knowing that it could cause suffering in the cause of peace building.
Thank you, that's a good question. And as Mujib pointed out well, being an activist comes with a price, but also not doing anything also comes with a price. And the Afghan peacebuilders, we were in a very unique situation where we were not just opposing the violence which were done by the Taliban, but by the NATO forces and the Afghan government, the so-called democratically elected government. So for me personally, that has not just taught me things to do, but give me a purpose in life. Knowing that other activists and well-known people like Mahatma Gandhi or Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan or even Martin Luther King, that they were working in a time where if it was not the same but similar situation, that they went against all these odds and spoke out and became and was working. They were working for what they thought they were doing the right thing, and I have learned that from the APVs, Afghan Afghan peacebuilders. So for me, having a disability and going to a center where there were other peace activists, I had this curiosity rather than being worried about myself much, because I was so much into learning and curiosity that I almost forgot about my own safety. So I made as much connection as I could, and beside working with the APVs, I was also managing a small library, which we were teaching street kids how to read and write, those who didn't have opportunities to go to school. So for me, it was, of course, it was not easy, but also it was a very rich time in my life, because I have learned a lot, and I found a purpose in life, which then became Stretch More, my organization, our organization that we are running. So overall, I'd say that working as a peace builder in Afghanistan made me a little better person, I think. Thank you. That's all.
Thank you. Can we sort of turn our attention now to another aspect, which is resettlement for people who are coming here as immigrants and migrants, refugees. Mujib, how can we, and you as refugees and migrants, how can we encourage and welcome the process that enables people to contribute to this country and where people are now living?
Look, and I think, and that's a brilliant question, Dale, so thank you. I think the onus is, in any situation, in any society, there are certain existing power arrangements or structures in place. There are certain, essentially, power dynamics. In Australia, we do have a mainstream dominant culture, and then there are the sort of peripheral cultures and identity groups. I think the first point, the point of departure, is to just have an honest conversation with ourselves and to really survey the lay of the land and get a feel for who is more in charge than others. And I think whoever is more in charge, the onus is really more on them than the others to make the condition, the situation conducive for others perhaps less abled, less resourceful, just a little more precarious, to then have a voice, to be enabled, to be empowered to have a voice. I think, unfortunately, in Australia, we have a fair bit to go for all who call this place home and are proud of their association with this beautiful country of ours, to actually have a voice. Like I was kind of alluding to earlier, at times I worry that not only are we not doing enough to empower and to enable and to give the platforms to others who might be less, less resourceful with a voice. We are actually, my fear is that we are actively peripheralizing. We are actively pushing those voices that perhaps makes us a little uncomfortable to the margins. I'll give you an example, and it's deeply personal. Going all the way back to 2016-17, there was a moment, there was a stretch as a sort of young, wide-eyed, emerging academic, or somebody who was aspired to be an academic. There was a stretch of time when I found myself just publishing so easily. Like it shocked me, like how easy it was to get published in established academic journals. And then almost like within less than a year, the challenges started mounting for me. The pushback started becoming more visible, more cerebral in that sense. The sort of, the critique that comes through that peer review process became a lot more challenging to overcome. And for a long time, I was like, what's going on here? What happened? What gives, right? But then now that I have, with the benefit of hindsight, and Dorothy, you would know this, and Alan, you too, as both of you established, seasoned academics, widely respected in your fields. With the benefit of hindsight, I look back, and I see that between 2018 or thereabouts, I made this whole shift in the type of critical language that I was using to explain Afghanistan. I was no longer just reproducing what others had already been saying since going back to the 90s. Right? I was uncomfortable with the language of critique that essentially comes to us from certain critical traditions, really, that were located in Europe. I was saying, no, I was very, very new and perhaps in some ways very naive, but I was curious to know what happens when one locates themselves with the APVs in Kabul and then tries to explain the world, as opposed to locating yourself within a Western Australian university and using the language that is made available to you there. Like between 2018 and maybe 19, when I moved to a different institution, I changed states and I went to Brisbane. I have this distinct moment where I kind of made a shift. And then there is all this pushback immediately activated by that. I'm just pointing that out as an example. Again, it's a very anecdotal case to point to. But certainly for me, it signifies this kind of pushback. The moment you make, you try to rock the boat a little bit, then you could also be exposed to attempts at reformation and at disciplining, right? At policing of your views and your perspective. So I've just experienced that, and this is more than anything, I'm just anxious about our future. We have to do more to empower and to enable voices that often find themselves at the margins. Now, they might be at peace being at the margins, and that's a beautiful thing, but the mainstream needs it because of what the migrant brings from their hybrid cultural identity.
Thank you. Nemat, the same question. Just how can immigrants and migrants be welcomed and supported and enabled to contribute to this country?
That's a good question, especially during this time when today is the first day of the Refugee Week, and there are so many protests across the UK, and in the town in a city where I work and live, where a lot of far-righters, they just do anything they like. If the moment they try to label you as a refugee, as someone who's not from there. But I know a lot of refugees who are, despite all these challenges, they are doing their best. I know a lot of refugees who are in the health. Sorry, it's just not right. In the health sectors in the health sector in England and across the UK, there are people who are part of the economic activities, who are part of the banks and doing all these amazing things. There are people who are doing this amazing charity work across the country. And for me personally, being a refugee there is both easy and difficult. Easy in the sense that there are a little bit liberty that I can do what I like in terms of charity work and going to the events, reading some poetry, but also difficult because the moment there is something that happens which comes from a person who has a refugee background or migration background, then the whole people are seen as hostile, as people who are really bad for the country. So how do we contribute to the societies where we live? I think refugees are not just contributing to the societies we live in, but also to the rest of the world. We know refugees who are doing amazing work across borders, and myself, I'm doing the work that I do regarding Stretchmore, and it is not just we are not just registered in England and Wales, but also we go outside and go across the world and help people with disabilities. So that sort of contribution, when people hear that we come from England or from the UK, so they might be thinking that, well, the UK society is good that they send these charity workers coming and doing all these programs. So I think contributing to the society, without a doubt, we do contribute a lot to the society, to the economy, and so many other areas. I know a lot of refugees who are volunteering in charity shops, who are helping others to learn, and I think that sorry about that. I think that we are able to contribute as long as we are empowered, as Mujib mentioned, as we are given the tools and we are given the space to work in our respective fields. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I'd like to ask one more question, and this is a personal question. And it's been a long journey for each of you, and it's a journey filled with trauma and difficulties. Just what sustains you in this journey?
Yeah, why not? Being a refugee is also a transforming journey. You come to know a lot about yourself and the life that you had before and the life that you're having now and the life that you might have in the future. So it is not easy, but I think it is also quite a journey that you can learn a lot from it, I think. Yeah.
That's really well put. It is indeed a transformative journey with ups and downs, peaks and valleys. I just 2 points really. So last year I really spent a lot of time spending time with Afghan refugees and community supporters, right? So mostly Australians or non-Afghan background, volunteers and community workers and people of faith backgrounds and so on and so forth. I spent a lot of time with these people in Brisbane and Sydney and here in Melbourne. So one of the things that seems to sustain and help a lot of Afghan asylum seekers and refugees just keep going, not to give up, not to, turn to pessimism, is these sort of connections and these bonds that they share with community volunteers, with peace activists, with people of faith, with just people at the level of the community who show a level of interest, and then these deeply meaningful bonds seems to form over time. It is a beautiful thing to see and experience, and for me, quite privileged to be trusted with these stories, but you see it all around. And there's something to be said about the nature of these relationships and the way that they're not bound by what the state dictates or thinks or what policy says or what the moment, what the moment is obsessed. In that moment we're obsessed with. Of course, humans are complex creatures, and these relationships is reflexive of that. I think that it transcends state politics and its boundaries, is what also makes it so liberatory and freeing. So I have always been deeply privileged. I've had these beautiful relationships. I think one of my dear friends, I should mention this, Anita Sekeli is, I think, most likely in the call, from Sydney. She's somebody who I came to know before even coming to Australia. She made me coming to Australia as a student. She was a conduit. She made it happen. Without that, the Australian government would have never issued me a visa. She just doggedly went after them and made it happen. And I see that a lot of people have similar stories and similar relationships. So that's one thing. The other thing is, to me, I think the spirituality, from whichever path, whichever trajectory we might be approaching it, and that's the beauty of a more esoteric, more mystic approach to spirituality. To me, tasawwuf or Islamic mysticism has been just a never-ending source of inspiration, of sustenance, of grounding. When I see Nemat or our other friends in the network being such an amazing representation of the Afghanistan's deep, or really the Persianate world's deep heritage and poetry, and She'r o Shairi and Adabiyat Farsi, I'm just elated to see that, because we're not letting go. We're not letting go of a millennia of heritage, of the likes of Rumi, of Fariduddin Attar, of Hafiz, of Sanai, right, of Bedel Dehlawi. These are the bodies of works of these people. To me, are like a compass. They're like a guide. And it's the deeper I go, the more I am convinced that that's the path, and I can stay away from darkness.
just to add a little bit on what Mujib said, like it really depends what type of people and environment you are surrounding yourself. If you are surrounding yourself with the right people, then you have more opportunities to help and to be helped, because you need to be helped to integrate into society. You cannot simply just go and say, I want to integrate, like how? So, and then the other thing that Mujib mentioned, I know a lot of refugees, including myself, that we don't just go to read or to go after analysis, but we go after more meanings of this journey that we had. What does that mean? And for me, it is also the tasawwuf poetry, which is spirituality, said in English. And that to have these people as not role models, but as people who are coming to help you sometimes, even if there are not many support available. So I think poetry does that, and we have a lot of Persian poets. So we speak many languages in Afghanistan, but Farsi is one of it. And we have this rich poetry heritage that helps me to cope in many aspects of my life as a refugee.
Oh, thank you. I'd like to pass over to Alan now. He's got some questions from the general audience.
Yes, we have. Thank you very much from the chat. And the first one is really a good follow-up and segue from your last answer, Nemat, and it's a question for Nemat, and I'll read it as it was sent. Your poetry helps the reader understand you and your experiences, helps the reader understand you and your experiences, the realities of war. I can imagine that writing poetry has helped you resist what Dr. Mujib identified as the social pressures to abandon yourself to a preconceived notion of who you are. Is there anything you would like to say about your poetry and or the experience of writing poetry?
That's a really good question. Thank you. Well, I think poetry, so the interesting thing is, I started writing poetry in English. I never wrote in my language, Farsi. I do read a lot in Farsi, but write in English. That is because when I was teaching at a internally displaced persons camp in Kabul, where Kathy came and visited us, I had this young, energetic student. Her name is Mariam, and she would always read poetry to me, and she just learned how to read and write, and that was the most beautiful thing that we had in the class. We had a person who was reading poetry almost every day in the class, and that inspired me to write her story. And then one day one of my friends said, why don't you just write it in lines and just make it a poetry? And then I tried, and then I found that to be a really good way of storytelling. So that's how. And then poetry helps me a lot when I'm, living with a disability and being a refugee in a new city or country that you don't know many people. Just having a few friends, I think it does the job. It helps you a lot to actually tell stories and to express yourself in the paper and writing.
Well, we have another question from the chat. With women in Afghanistan silenced, isolated, deprived of education and freedom to be themselves, this gender apartheid is a violence. How can we get peace and equity into the Taliban agenda and see their own violence as an abomination? And how do we empower women to work within these limitations?
Do you want me to go first?
Joy, please.
Well, at the moment, myself as an activist, I don't think I have that, that protection or something that I would go and do some activities in Afghanistan. But we are planning to not just cover Afghanistan, but other conflict areas in the future through our organization, Stretch More. and we are planning to do our first training in a war-stricken area in 2029. So we are hoping to reach everyone. Everyone in the sense, if we go to Afghanistan, for example, we want to reach not just disabled people, but disabled people we want to reach through our activities, but we want to include more vulnerable people among the vulnerable group of disabled people, because we have so many vulnerable people even among disabled communities. Women is one of them, and women are one of them. So we are thinking to do that. So I think we can resist in many ways. We can resist in writing poetry. We can resist in drawing. We can resist in just not giving up and then helping each other online. And I think that's what people can do. But personally, I am planning to cover conflict areas in the future through our charity, not just in Afghanistan, but in other places where women are facing these type of challenges. And just to add something that we may not be the best people to talk for women's rights in Afghanistan and how it should be done, but myself personally and my team, we are thinking to start working in these areas and help women as well.
Okay, I think just following on from what Nemat was saying, I second the notion that we are perhaps, as men, both of us, not the position ideally to speak on it, but of course that cannot be a cop-out. Now, in Afghanistan right now, femininity, this is what, gives me chills to think about it. That femininity has become a source of fear, of anxiety. There's a certain phobia that the Taliban, certainly its leadership, its brass, has towards women, but state control, having a control of the state, of government, by its very nature, because they seem to have the levers of control, whether it's educational institutions, schools and universities, whether it's the various ministries of culture, of information, and this and that. It's to have the custodianship or control of the state is such that they will try to have their imprint. They have an image of Afghanistan and they will try to cast that over the rest of the country, over 35 million people. So unfortunately, I see a shift already, just being an observer, between now and when I compare now to August 2021, for the worst. That phobia, that anxiety about femininity is becoming more and more mainstreamed and normalized. That scares me. That gives me chills to my spine. And yet at the same time, Afghanistan, since going back to 1978, revolutionary politics, top-down attempts at reform, at reimagining society, at modernization essentially, has always activated the sorts of violent backlash that, hasn't given us anything more than war and destruction and carnage. So what I'm trying to say, and this is not easy, but we ought to be vigilant, we ought to be critical, we ought to hold the Taliban to account. But at the same time, we ought to be honest enough with the history, with our history. What the Soviet promise was in the 80s. Before that, what Marxist-Leninists, Afghan-born indigenous Marxist-Leninists had promised, what the Soviets tried to enforce throughout the 80s, what the Islamists throughout the 90s tried to deliver, what the liberal Western forces tried to deliver, all of it through revolutionary means gave us more suffering, not less. You just have to learn, I think, from that 40 years of history and be honest with ourselves to know that there are better ways, other ways. I'm just going to finish on this, and I won't repeat too much of what Nemat has brilliantly put, but everyday forms of resistance There's a lot of potential in there. It's just because we don't hear it, just because it's not visible, it's not organized, doesn't mean that Afghans in Afghanistan are reduced or resigned to their fate. They are resisting, they are pushing back, they are challenging the authorities at every turn. But it's evasive, and it's by design. It's improvisational. It comes in everyday forms. Resistance that dares not to speak in its name, because when you do that, when you come out to the public, right, and do it publicly in an organized fashion, the way that we in the West think that's the only resistance that counts, you expose yourself to disciplinary power. Just as far as I know, at least, that's happening all around, and we have to find ways to, in solidarity, work with people.
Sorry, Timo, you want to...
Just add a little bit on that. Just from last week, since last week, there's been a widespread protest in Herat and in some of the other provinces in Afghanistan. So they are resisting. They are, I think the men, they have had enough of it. Even in the past, it was really bad since the Taliban came in power. Previously and even this time, it's really bad. But there are protests and there are resistance happening around the country, and some of them are not covered by the media. And maybe, as Mujib said, they are scared to come out. But they found ways around it, around education, at least through internet. But of course, that's not the way that people should learn. But there are activities happening around the country. Some of them I know, and some of the friends that I know, we are helping at least the women in our families, in our relatives who are in Afghanistan, to somehow help them to learn a little bit and find a way around and do that.
Yeah, and if I can, so just quickly, I'm just reminded of somebody who spoke of power. There is no Nazism that's absolute. And in the same vein, there's no Taliban force that's absolute. Power will always have cracks and fissures, and there will always be openings to counter it, to push back. And I am convinced that as much as they would like to, that's just how ideology works, they would like to be absolute and totalitarian. But doesn't matter how far you want to go back, certainly in modern history, in any given society, there are always these, blind spots that then could be turned into and repurposed as opportunities to push back.
I think we're coming close to time, but the person who did with the question on gender apartheid has a follow-up question. Do men in Afghanistan talk to each other about this? About the gender apartheid?
Well, go ahead.
No. Look, I mean, we're not I'm not in Afghanistan, so.
Yes.
But from what I'm privy to, yes, that anxiety that I feel, I know that a lot of the people that I stay in contact with and that are my kind of interlocutors in these, in this particular moment in the country, of course they have the same anxieties. Of course they would like, they are terrified and horrified at the turn of events. Remember, in the lead up to the Doha peace agreement in February of 2020, what were the Taliban saying? We have changed. This is Taliban 2.0. In Qatar, they kept saying, women's rights are protected, their right to education, their right to work, that minorities will be protected, that we will not impose a certain jurisprudential, interpretation of Islam that homogenizes. But when August 21 happened and they incrementally, slowly but surely turned sort of to a certain interpretation, that I think people are horrified by that. But also because if it just sustains itself this way, if there is no pivot or change in their attitudes, the fear is that eventually there is a confrontation, a turn to a military solution. And people are worried about that.
Right. I think Mujib is right. We are not in Afghanistan. We are refugees in other lands, and but as long as I know, some of the villagers that we were like from the same village, there are people, yes, they talk to each other about this issue, but they cannot do anything against weapons. Most of them are scared. They got family to provide to. I believe there are, but it might be very the people talking to each other, but it might be a very small minority that may not make any difference, unfortunately.
Well, this has been an incredibly rich exchange. I think we need to find ways in which we can continue it. So thank you both very much. Efat was online, but her connection broke down, so she was going to participate in this exchange. So we now turn to the next segment, and I think this is going to be hosted by Dorothy in relation to poetry.
Yes, thank you. And it has already been said by Mujib and Nemat, the centrality, the profound place of poetry in the Afghan and in the Persian tradition, a tradition that brings solace and inspiration and spiritual direction in a way that I think is hard to grasp from a Western perspective, the depth of that. From that rich reservoir of the tradition, there's been a small trickle to Western society that's come to us through the poetry of the 13th century Sufi poet Rumi and 14th century Hess. But that's about the limit of the knowledge in the West. And my small appreciation of the depth of poetry in your tradition came to me when Alan and I were befriended, introduced by Kathy Kelly to a couple. The young woman in the couple was an Afghan peace builder and had worked with street children and with women. And she and her husband, she's happy for me to use her name, and her name is Nazgul Hassani, and her husband had been a democracy activist and campaigner for human rights in Afghanistan, and they had fled after August 21. And Alan and I connected to them through email, through WhatsApp, as they hid in one single room in Islamabad, having no visas to be in that country, having no pathway to a safer country. And suicides were occurring by Afghans in their immediate neighbourhood who had been denied entry to safer countries. So a time of great despair. And so here we are, an old couple, and reaching out across the barrier of age and of culture and of language and of faith tradition. And it was the poetry of Rumi that gave us a universal language and a deepening in our connection. And I suggested to Nazgul that if I shared my favourite lines of Rumi with her, would she share her favourite lines of Rumi with me? I'll share my favourite lines with you now, and I will share Nazgul's favourite lines at the end of this poetry session. The lines that I shared speak to me of all of us, in one way or another, finding our way home, in a spiritual sense. But of course, the refugee journey is also about finding a place where one might feel a little bit at home, and over time, more at home. Never the home of the homeland, but a place where there may be a sense of belonging if the society can create the conditions for that to develop and the joint identities to be welcomed and to be respected. So the words that I said to Nazgul were, there are countless ways to kneel and kiss the earth. There are countless ways to find your way home again. It's not surprising, given the profound place of poetry in the Afghan soul, in the Afghan psyche, that Afghans on the refugee journey would turn to poetry, the poetry of the past, as a source of solace and inspiration and spiritual guidance, but also, for some, to write poetry of their own, to reflect and capture the presence. So it's my great privilege and honour to introduce two young Afghan poets. You've already met Nemat, and I will say a little bit more about Nemat's poetry. But we're joined online by Nazila Nawan. Nazila is not in a safe place, and Nazila's face will not be shown to us. And we are using a pseudonym today. Nazila is a writer and a poet, and I have forged a friendship that I am lost for words to describe in terms of its depth. I think we've written more than 100,000 words to one another in emails about all sorts of things, and I treasure this friendship, and I welcome Nazila to be with us today. Nazila self-taught in English. She dedicated years to learning English, and she taught Afghan girls and young women English, and has continued to do so online in more recent times. She earned her degree in international relations at a time of great turbulence and violence in her country. And during that war, she sustained a very serious injury. Nazila began writing poems in Farsi when she was 18, finding in poetry a sanctuary from all of the turmoil. She now writes in English as well, and what I find truly extraordinary, she translates her Farsi poems into English. And we will hear two of those from Nazila today. Her poetry comes from a place of profound suffering, and it has themes of love and beauty and resilience and hope and solitude. Her personal story is one of prolonged separation from her father, who tried to reach this country to safety and was subject to the cruel policies of offshore detention, subject to years on Nauru and Manus Island, and still awaits the possibility of resettlement in Canada. And if that occurs, then his family will be able to go there too. It's to the enduring shame of my country that he and his family, among countless others, have suffered to the degree that they have and continue to do so. As we listen to Nazila read her first poem called Migration, we shall see an image of a painting by her younger teenage sister. These are two very talented sisters. The painting is titled, and it will come on the screen, the painting is titled Young Afghan Girl Fleeing Her Country. You will see in the foreground a war-torn pavement on both sides of the street. And then in the distance you will see the stars and the hope of a young girl wearing the colours of the Afghan flag. And in the second poem, you will see another image of painted by the younger sister of Nazila. So let me welcome Nazila to our webinar, who will say a few words about her poem Migration before reading it to us, after which I will thank her, and then I will invite her to read her second poem, My Dream is Simple. Thank you for joining us today, Nazila.
Greetings and peace to everyone, and thank you so much for having me. It's a great pleasure and honor to be with you today. My first poem, Migration, which I'm going to read to you, is actually the story of countless Afghan families, including my own. I wrote it during a time when my mother, siblings, and I were migrants in one place, while my father was a migrant in another place. And we were scattered, moving from city to city in search of safety. And in those moments, poetry became the only language that could hold my feelings and my family's struggles. Since for most Afghans, migration has never been a choice. It has been a compulsion. But within that compulsion, Afghans have tried to find meaning, to preserve dignity, and to keep hope alive. And this poem is a reflection of that journey, of youth lost, of families divided, of freedom turned to an empty world. And it's both personal and collective, and carries the voice of those who continue to search for life across oceans, mountains, and borders. Thank you.
The poem Migration to us, please, Nazila.
Yes, as I have a unstable internet connection right now, I prefer to play the pre-recording of my poetry reading, as I'm hesitant if in the middle of my reading my internet goes off. Migration. One lost his youth beyond the oceans. Another faded on this side of the mountains. One in the clamor of crowded cities searches for life. The other, on a cold and distant island, stares at a wall of photographs. He weeps for his family, their faces now forgotten. He weeps for the life he never lived, and for the breaths already wasted. And freedom, a word that has lost its meaning.
Would you like to give us a brief introduction to your second poem, My Dream is Simple? And while we hear that, we will see another image of a painting by your younger sister called Urban Vision, which is her dream of a city in Afghanistan which lives in peace, where girls ride bicycles and play football and go to school.
Yes, sure. My dream is simple. It actually comes from the longing of a young Afghan girl for peace, equality, and education, and for the simple wish to be reunited with her father. And it actually indicates my own history with my father, And I have written it to show that how even the smallest dreams, like being in a classroom for an Afghan girl or standing together at a fall, can feel impossible in a world shaped by war, disdains, and separation. And in this painting, my sister has tried to show what she desired for, but words were never able to express. And we both, I can express myself through poetry, but my sister finds the painting and pictures the best possible way to express herself. And in this painting, you can see that it is a peaceful city, and this is what we all desire for and have been longing for such a long time. And now let's go to the second poem, My Dream is Simple. The recording, please. My dream is simple. A touch of equality and a sprinkle of shared humanity, where love is the world's language and hearts beat free from walls and wires. Imagine an Afghan girl stepping into sunlight, her laughter echoing through a classroom, where the games of power are forgotten as stories, and every mother holds her child close, not lost to the chaos of war. My dream is simple, to stand beside my father at Niagara Falls, the waters roar, washing our worries away, the breeze kissing our faces, together in a world where distance means nothing. Why do these dreams feel so far away? A world within reach, yet out of grasp.
Nazila and Hoda Hafiz, may God keep you safe. The poetry from which Nazila has read is in this book, and I think at the bottom of the slide there may be my email, which if you wish to buy this book or these cards, please email me, and all the proceeds will go to Nazila, her sister, and their family. It is now my great pleasure to introduce again Nemat Ahangosh, and his poetry has already been referred to by Alan. Nemat describes himself as a refugee, an Afghan refugee poet. And in his book, The Colour of Peace, which you can buy online, his writing focuses on war and displacement and human connection in very direct language, simple and direct language, which brings alive the experiences of marginalised people. Nemat's poems are available, they're published and online in literary journals, in platforms in Australia, Afghanistan, India, the UK and the US. I think I got them all right, Nemat. And he is a new voice in contemporary refugee poetry, and as Alan said earlier in the day, he has won an award, Frederick Douglass Writing Award, for his poetry, and spoke at a single event at Mansfield College in Oxford in relation to his poetry. And mostly reads his poetry in Brighton, a city in the UK, which he describes as calling home. May we all find our way home again. Thank you, Nemat. If you'd like to introduce your two poems and then read them to us, it would be a great honour for us to hear them.
Thank you, Dorothy. And before going into my poetry, I'd like to say that the poems Nazila read was powerful and beautiful. and I think they resonate a lot with me, with my poems, and I think your poetry complements the contemporary refugee poetry. So thank you, Nazila. Before I read the first poem, I'd like to mention that it comes from a place of longing, from imagining what it means to be simply allowed to dream. In all the things, which is the title of the first poem, I speak about the small, ordinary wishes and how even those can feel fragile in a world shaped by war and survival. It is about loss, yes, but also about the stubbornness of imagining freedom. All the things. If all the things allowed me, I would have 1,000 dreams. I would have 1,000 things. If all the things allowed me, it would be simple. I would have 1,000 simple dreams. I would have 1,000 simple things. If all the things allowed me, it would be happy. I would be happy. I would have 1,000 reasons. If all the things allowed, some would not be killed. Some could watch sunset with a cigarette among their lips, only if their eyes were not shut. If bullets would not tear their chest in half, their dreams would still fly in and out of their lungs. If all the things allowed, some would go to the beach, would not be scared of soldiers. Their stomach wouldn't be growling, or they wouldn't be swallowed by sea while seeking shelter, starved to death or stripped of their dreams. If all the things allowed, a mother could see her child. Children would go to school, they would make noise and would make more noise. If all the things allowed, many would still be living, would still love and be loved. Their dream would still fly in and out of their lungs. Many would have a shoulder to weep on. Doesn't matter if sad or happy tears. All the things allowed you to give a shoulder to those who need, those who weep. And that is more powerful than all rifles combined. So the next poem, I wrote it while thinking about displacement and what we call home. In the Book of Love, which is the title of the next poem, I speak as someone trying to hold together memory, violence, and love in the same breath. It is about resilience, but also about tenderness and how courage can still exist in the middle of rupture. The Book of Love. I am Kabul, fallen many times, risen infinitely. Perhaps when this night is over, I'll wake up at home. May you never have nights like this. May you always wake up at home. Still we can be courageous and intoxicated by love. Maybe this is not home. I have fallen in love a few times and my heart was broken a few times. So do not tell me this place will never become home. Because love, courage, and heartbreak are the closest things I know to home. Nobody truly knows why anybody is here anyway. I have abandoned a life I once knew. I have left parts of me somewhere. I still search for them. The courageous act is saying hello to strangers. And glory belongs to those who resist the language of hatred, fear, and cruelty. Courage can disguise itself as sunlight or a simple greeting, the kind without which the world would fall apart. And when children ask, "Who is that man?" you would answer, "Our neighbor, our doctor, a teacher, a librarian, a human." May you read many poems, good poems, not mine. One should write about happy things, silly things, things that make sense in an ordinary and absurd world. But instead, I write about war, what it takes from a body and what it lives in a home. Maybe violence is absurd after all. I should be reading the book of love instead, because it is never enough. Flipping through its pages, a bookmark made of friendship resting in an odd page. Pausing every now and then over a sentence about peace, then passing it on to other lovers of the book. Thank you.
Tashakor. Thank you, Nemat. I'll close our poetry section of our webinar today with sharing with you the lines of Rumi that my friend Nazgul Husani shared with me. And the context, as I've said, where they were living in fear and uncertainty with no prospect of a home and a place of safety. And despite that, she chose her favourite words of Rumi, words that uphold the ideals that Afghan peacebuilders exemplify. It was deeply moving to hear her read this in Dari and her husband translate line for line in English. In this earth, in this soil, in this pure field, let us not plant any seeds, but the seeds of compassion and love. Tashakor. Thank you.
Well, that has been an amazingly powerful session. And I just need to get some advice, and a big shout out to Matt Jasper and his team, who have navigated 4 continents. Do we have Rosemary Morrow with us?
I'm told we do.
We do? Mm-hmm. Oh, wow, wonderful, because the last message. Ro is very well known to the Afghan peacebuilders, having been to Kabul many times. She's shown in the program as Rosemary. I've never heard anybody in the last 10 years in my circle call her anything but Ro. She's one of the most prominent permaculturists in the world. She trained in agricultural science at the University of Sydney, in rural sociology at the Sorbonne, development studies at Reading, and horticulture at TAFE. She spent time living in L'Arche in France and later at Jordan Village in England, where she realised she would become a Quaker, a commitment that shapes the ethical frame of her mind. Disillusioned with conventional agriculture after time in Africa, she turned to permaculture as an ethically grounded, applied ecological design system. Since the 1980s, she's taught permaculture design courses across Africa, Central and Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, and the Pacific. She's also worked in European context affected by economic crises in Spain, such as Spain, Greece, and Portugal, linking permaculture to livelihood resilience. I sometimes say to Ro, why do you do all the easy gigs? No, Cox's Bazar refugee camp, the largest refugee camp in the world in Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Horn of Africa, Iraq. Ro is also the author of several widely used permaculture texts. And perhaps her major work, she completely reconfigured in a way that upended permaculture orthodoxy, because it was written, this is the Earth Restorer's Guide to Permaculture, because it was written from the perspective of the marginalised and the dispossessed as a highly practical work that could be used in refugee camps and other areas which are difficult in order to do permaculture practice. I think, Ro, I'll pass to you.
Well, thank you, Alan. I think I just am some sort of soul sister of Kathy Kelly and yourself, Alan, who does it through the mind and the wonderful people we meet and the joys. However, what I'd like to speak to you now about as we come to the end of this seminar is that this is Refugee Week across the world. The number of refugees is growing. And today we have covered a huge world by going through the Afghan peace workers and volunteers in various forms. We have covered the global problems. We've looked obliquely at militarism and its brutality. We've looked at displacement of people. We've looked at the futility of war. And when we look at a world beyond war, we could see how peaceful and productive it was if the work in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Somalia had been to give a peaceful and prosperous country. The problems that we have today would have been avoided. However, what I'm really interested in is that the impetus to peace and the impetus to non-violent behaviour in particular, whether it's language, actions, however we do it, usually comes from individuals. So we could think of Jesus, Muhammad, definitely advocated non-violence and peace. We can come forward through time, and every society has had someone who said, let's live with peace. Let's live non-violently. We have Dr. King. We have Mahatma Gandhi. And in the South Pacific, little known, we have T. Fitty, the great New Zealand peace worker who absolutely refused to pick up arms, but he carried out a vast non-violent campaign. It is rare that we have a group, almost a leaderless group, though definitely instigated by Hakim Yong, but a group which takes us in from the 2000s, leads again in peace and non-violence. And I'm asking not exactly what they did. Did they bury the guns? Did they pour blood on cannons? Did they plant the fields where they were shut out? Where did that inner truth come from? And how does it work? And through all this seminar today, which has been so amazing, from the psychological with Efat, talking about the techniques we can use to bring ourselves to calm, to the political and cultural from Mujib, which was so well covered for all of us. Back to Nemat's, how it can lead you to carry on in another life, doing something valuable for others and creation. This inner truth that we have been subject to today, where does it come from and how's it set afire? And that was my question behind it all. I believe that we all have a conscience. We all have, to some extent or another, responses to justice, peace, generosity, compassion, gentleness, hospitality, all the great universals through time and space that people recognise. Sometimes, some of us, it's a little scarred or numb from being damaged. War damages people often very badly, so war can create more war because people know nothing else. How do we open up that inner truth so that people can respond? My sense is sometimes you need people like the peace volunteers or Dr. King or T. Fitty to say there's another way we can act and respond to injustice, to cruelty, to lack of compassion. But we need those people who take us forward into that. And so whether it is Dr. King or whether it is Allah speaking about peace or whether it's Buddha talking about inner tranquility, whether it is other leaders in all our societies, we all have that. And sometimes we need that little scraping back to reveal that conscience so that it can become active. Sometimes we need the models, and what was taken to the Afghan young people were models. They studied these models, took their scars or their, we could call it a seed coat off so they could grow, and then they could develop their own nonviolence, which again has become a historical marker in the world of peace and nonviolence, similar to others. Although scattered through the world and doing wonderful things, this group of young people have laid down, without ever wanting it or motivated, a history of peace and nonviolence because they never knew peace. They didn't know peace from want. They didn't know peace from war. They're the double violences, right? The need for water or good food. The Afghans I saw in 1970 were this much taller than the Afghans I saw in the 2000s because of nutrition. So I saw the country move differently. What this seminar has shown us, how war is an unnecessary and vile blot on human truth and human ability to thrive, to grow, to fulfill, and for people to be themselves. But through the seminar today, whether it's Nemat or it's Mujib or Kathy's example or lovely Efat, what we have is examples of ways that we can be the motivation. And I think this seminar today has told another story of nonviolence and of setting a precedent and opening it up to others so we can recognise and know in the long tradition of peaceful living and nonviolent behaviours so that everyone benefits, or at least no one is hurt. So we have covered the local. You know, we're introduced by Kathy to the actual behaviours of the peace volunteers acting locally. And there are many, many more examples. Then we have seen how that has spread out across the world. Same time, we've been inhibited by the violence of the Australian Army, the unfair refugee policies across the world. And I hope in some way that we can remove our seed coats and grow more into mercy and justice, compassion, and that great Islamic virtue of hospitality to the stranger, where we lay down our weapons, today the laws, and we invite in across the world in various ways the refugees of many types that can learn. And I think bringing this together around the Afghan peace group has been a most sensational way of looking at the world today, but also looking at where we can go. So I will finish now because I'm sure we're out of time, but I would like to thank everyone who presented. It's been absolutely fabulous. Nemat's story of the people with disability and teaching them to swim, the wonderful Mujib's look at what being a refugee does in terms of values and destruction, but primarily values, the double cultures, the strengths, the ability, the knowledge of two cultures. If Australia hadn't had refugees, we would be a pathetic country. Everything from food to grandchildren, to our education system, to our music, to our beliefs, to our structures, to our neighbours, a desperate impoverishment. And so I hope today that throughout the world and throughout this week of refugees and through this seminar with World Beyond War, that we can somehow open up and use these materials to take the seed coat off that seed of the inner truth, which we all have, and perhaps enable it to grow. Thank you, everyone who participated. It's been sensational, and I'm sure we'll use it again. Thank you.
Thank you, Ro, and I'm so pleased that your internet held up, because I was going to ask Matt to do the impossible and find Sister Jean Clark to do the benediction, but you did a most amazing Quaker benediction. So, friends, I think we've come to the end of our time together. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and I hope this has been a rich and rewarding time for you. It certainly has been for me. I'm just have a very warm inner glow about the amazing stories that we've heard today. Thank you. Tashakor. Hodra Hafiz.